on? Are we? Is it recording? Is it on? Okay. Here we go. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Working Musicians Podcast, or whatever I named it on my blog website thing. I am your host, Dris Organica, and I've got to admit, I've been a naughty boy. I've been a very naughty boy, yes. I haven't been getting around to as many of these as I need to. I've got plenty of them that I can put out. I'm just too lazy to get around to doing it. My bad, but I've got lives and stuff in between that. I got promoted at my job, all kinds of fun stuff. So I've just been hanging out, doing all kinds of stuff. But I'd like to let everybody know that I stopped drinking. I stopped drinking yesterday at around 11:30 p.m. It's now 11:30 a.m. and I am now drinking again. And what I am drinking is Miller High Life. A stupid cheap beer. I don't know why they've got it so cheap right now. It's like $6 for a 12-pack. I mean, gosh, can't argue with the numbers there. So, yeah, that's what is helping make this episode come to life. Miller High Life. $6 I'm sorry, I lied. It was $7 after tax for a 12-pack of bottles. That is awesome. Salute. Hear that? That's the sound of frosty refreshment enjoyment live on the air. Although, it's not really live because I'm going to record it and then you'll play it back later. So not live on the air, but as it's actively happening right now, it was live. So I've been a naughty boy. I haven't gotten around to doing many of these, and I do apologize to probably the three of y'all who listen. But, sometimes good things come to those who wait. I don't even know if I'll put this one directly out. But I think I'm at a point where I'm realizing that if I put too much effort into making these super perfect at cut and clean, that it's going to take me forever to get around to editing them. Obviously, if I have like a crash and burn session, like the ceiling fan falls down and starts smashing me in the face, I might just have to go ahead and edit that out a little bit. Although it might actually be better if I didn't, right? But so I think what I'm going to try to do is focus on doing a better job of talking. And I've noticed the more of these I do, the less editing I have to do. So that's good. It's just like anything. You get better at it with time. But so the two things I'm going to do is I'm not going to worry about so many edits. So forgive me if there's some extra like pauses, some lip smacks or anything like that. A little off topic because I'm not going to, if I have to sit around here and edit them all day, or by all day, I mean for like a whole 30, 40 minutes, it's just not going to end up happening at the rate I want them to. And that's where I've gotten to. I'll get around to where I've halfway edited something, I stop, I come back, I don't know where I'm at. And just like, then I go to, listen to it and I realize I've made major mistakes. Oh, crap, I forget what I've done. So I'm going to try to not do as much of that editing stuff and just kind of give it to you more raw to where it actually kind of feels like it is sort of, live, raw, unpolished, Saint anger, not mastered. It's just this is what it is. It is what it is. It may be unjust, but it is what it is. Probably hear more burps on air than ever, that's for sure. So even though it's not live, it might as well be live because I don't plan on doing a lot of editing. Another thing I'm trying to do is I've noticed that it seems like the more of these I do, the less I tend to focus on the audio capturing quality. So I'm in there like basically breathing in the mic and it's like, you add a little bit of limiting to it so that it can be nice and loud, and it gets to where the audio is starting to get kind of bad, And of course my DBX 386 went out again for whatever reason. And of course I didn't realize it went out until after I recorded an entire episode through it called Choosing a Mix Engineer or something like that. I haven't even broadcasted it out yet. It's not even, you can't even download it right now. But perhaps by the time I get this episode out, it will be available for streaming or download. I just don't know. I think I might just go ahead and put this one out right as, because I don't have to edit it. I know it's good. The other ones, I still may have to edit. I just don't know. So that's kind of where we're at with this. But And I noticed just in general, the sound quality wasn't quite where it needed to be, and no wonder why. I just basically stick a mic in front of my face. I have a tendency to get too close to it. Yes, I use this cheap piece of crap pop filter, but I don't think it's very effective when I've got it like an inch away from the capsule of the microphone. And within the capsule of the microphone, I took out the internal windscreen because I didn't like the way it made recorded acoustic guitars sound, right? And I like the way it sounds better without it. Unfortunately, it makes wind noise and plosives that much more evident. So I've gotten a little bit of feedback about that, and they're absolutely right. I knew they were right. I could tell, but I just was kind of in a position where it's like, whatever. So now I'm going to do less editing and try to do a better job of not trying to swallow the mic, try to stay off a little bit, and hopefully get rid of some of the extra breath thing. And something else I did is I put one of my small child's socks over the microphone. This is to act as like an external windshield and pop filter, sort of, so to speak. So hopefully that'll take away some of the airiness. It might make my vocals a little bit duller, but that's okay because I'm kind of, a good 6-8 inches away from the mic now, so I don't have to worry about that proximity to the same effect. So this would be interesting. I'm going to go back, listening to this after I'm done recording and be like, wow, this sounds weird, but however it sounds, that's how it sounds. And I'll just keep getting better at it day by day. So what I'm basically saying is you can stop giving me shit about how I record my free programming, because I'm aware. But, I appreciate the feedback, but hey, you're not paying for it. I'm not asking for money. Shut up. So today what I'm going to talk about is reading between the lines, which is after that first rant. You might think that within itself was the podcast. But no, it's. I just wanted to talk today about reading between the lines, right? Sorry, another sound, just get used to. That's the sound of me vaping. I don't smoke anymore, but from time to time I like to have me a nice vape. All right. So, reading between the lines, what I mean by this is taking information you get, what you've seen, what you see other people doing, what you've heard, and what you've read, and compiling it and kind of like finding out what the common denominator is, what the real truth is. Case in point, there's a website I really like going to if I ever buy electronics. It's called Newegg.com. They're not endorsing me, but I just think regardless, I'm not going to say they have the world's best prices, although they're pretty darn good. I'm not going to say they have the world's best anything, but I tell you what, if I'm going to order anything online, and it's not like through Amazon, I'm going to go through Newegg because I think it's an awesome service. They have computer parts that you just can't get anywhere else for that kind of price, and customer service is great, right? And all that being said, yeah, that's a good reason why most people go to visit the site. But another reason I like to go to the site is it has this huge following of people who review products. Even if they didn't buy them on Newegg, they will review it and put their review and comments on Newegg because it's kind of come to be known amongst, especially like your computer kind of nerds, which I can't really say I'm a computer nerd anymore. I mean, yes, I built the computer I'm currently using like several years ago, but I haven't built too many in the last, I think it's been a good 5-6 years since I built probably more like 4 years since I last built a computer. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's up to date. But I tell you what, when I do try to figure out what's going on, there's a few websites I like to visit, but I really like to visit Newegg.com because of the reviews. And they've got a reputation, and it's kind of like a fun thing to do. You get something kind of cool, whether it be a graphics card, a RAM, a TV, whatever, and you go and you review it on Newegg because a lot of people really find these reviews helpful. And what I've come to notice is probably what most people have kind of come to notice as well, is that you have to read between the lines here. You'll see people and they'll put their experience level as high, yet they make a mistake that a rookie mistake, so clearly they're not an expert because they made a dumb mistake. Now, everyone is capable of making dumb mistakes, but if the reason why you're giving your RAM a bad review, your memory a bad review is because it's not designed to work on your motherboard because it's a completely different architecture and everything, and it doesn't literally fit, and you didn't know that, you clearly don't have a high, a high expertise level, right? And so that's the kind of thing where you have to take what people say and take it with a grain of salt. But the same thing can be applied towards, information you receive, product reviews towards music, this, that, and the other thing. And while clearly there's you got to kind of take out the best, chop off the worst, and look for what's in the middle. And you'll find that, you'll kind of find a common denominator somewhere in there. And the big thing to keep in mind is who is reviewing the product, who is telling you this information, all right, and how do they relate to you? Case in point, where I'm really trying to get to is, we hear a lot of stuff about what musicians should do, how you should record things, how you should market yourself, right? And without going into too much detail over somebody I know, met, am acquainted with, family, super friend, whatever their relation to me happens to be, I'm not going to go into that. However, I am going to go into this. So I have an acquaintance of some sort who is wanting to go to this big university to get her master's degree in music marketing or something to that extent. And I get it, it's kind of hip, cool, but man, what a waste of money. And so I'm like, well, hey, tell me what's the best way for from what you found, and she's in the program right now. I think she's not too far from finishing. And what's really the best thing for someone like me to do? And she's like, well, you just got to get on the social network and just hit it hard and hit it all the time. You just went to a big fancy school, getting your master's, and that's your answer? Like, I don't need someone to get with a master's degree to tell me that. Like, but if that's your idea of this, of what it, like, good grief, that's not good information. I'm not saying it's not true or valid, right? So literally, that's what I need to do is I need to get on the Twitter, the Instagram, the Facebook, the whatever, the SoundCloud. Oh, have you ever heard of this thing called SoundCloud? I'm like, no, because I'm a fucking idiot. I don't know anything about this. And, how about, I've heard of this thing called Facebook. Is that good? Like, come on, I'm not that old. Do you think I don't know what Facebook it was? Hell, I was around when Facebook first came out. You know what I mean? It gets to the point where, like, these programs have evolved so much that people don't realize that they're nothing like they originally were when they first came out. And that's why some of these older people have a hard time using them. It's like, wait a second. This whole, like, interface completely changed. I don't know what's going on, right? But here we go. Somebody virtually on the verge of getting a master's degree in music marketing tells me, oh, the best thing to do is just get on the social network and keep it coming, right? That's what you need to do. Really? You're going to school and that's the best answer you got? That's that's great that you the same thing that I'm seeing on the internet and just common knowledge, seems like common marketing sense in today's world, and what they're teaching in, big 4-year, or actually at this point, postgraduate studies are the same. But geez, do you really know to go to school for someone to tell you that? And from this point, when talking about reading between the lines, I don't care what her education level is. I'm not too interested in what she has to say, because clearly she's a moron for spending all this money to get a degree in this particular career path, but also because I don't think she's really going much other than scratching beneath the surface, or just, maybe she just was impatient, but no, this was a long conversation. It talked to me about how SoundCloud and how all these people have made it big off of SoundCloud. I'm like, okay, that's great. I'm just listening, and I'm trying to be polite, because they're, granted, in all fairness, they are a good bit younger than me. They're about 10 years I'm about 10 years their senior, so maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe I'm just, not willing, I'm not giving them any credit just because I don't respect their opinion. And maybe that's something to be on the fault of me, but come on. If you go to school and that's the best thing you have as far as advice, to help a musician who wants to promote their music. I mean, I was just making conversation now, so I wasn't taking it that serious to begin with, but like, really? you need to go to school to tell you that? That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. So, okay, so the reason why I make mention of this is because even if somebody is an expert or claims to be an expert or is perceived to be an expert, sometimes you have to kind of take a discount of what they're saying because they may be looking at this from a perspective that is not relative to yourself, right? So, marketing a band like Aerosmith is completely different than marketing someone like yourself, right? Now, there's a lot of the same principles apply, but, it's completely different when you're talking about using overhead and money and stuff and not. One's a household name, one is not. They know who the members of that band are. They don't know who you are. They have a following. They have a reputation, a history, a kind of a vibe, a story. You don't, right? So maybe some better advice would be for you is to tell your story, right? Get it out there, do interviews, tell your story, get people to know who you are, and as a result, get them to know who your music is, what your music is, right? If they like you, there's a good chance they're going to be more receptive to listening to your music because at least they have some kind of an interest within you, right? Just some food for thought from somebody from a completely different perspective than somebody who's looking to try to market, Poof Diddley and Jay Zizzle and things like that, the Kanye's, all kinds of these kinds of things. So that's kind of they're more of a pop rap kind of a person. So, and that's okay. We all have different aspirations and best of wishes to them. Watch them end up being super successful. And I'm over here, speaking about reading between the lines. Why would you ever listen to this guy? He's a hack. He's a loser. He's a nobody. He doesn't know anything. Look at who I am. I'm brilliant. All right. So once again, read between the lines, even with what I'm telling you. But as far as when it comes to advice, on how to run your musical operation, obviously doing research is a good idea, but you have to read between the lines, right? So let's flip this over into gear, right? Because I talked about, reading between the lines when it comes to who's telling you what, because they might have a completely different perspective than you. And you see this so much when it comes to gear, right? Now, obviously, there is a difference between a $5,000 microphone and a $50 microphone, right? And it seems like all the time we hear reviews on sites where people like Musician's Friend, GuitarCenter.com, I'm sure there's others, right? B&H Photo is another one I like. Their prices are pretty good. Except for they have weird days where they're closed. I don't quite understand. I've never ordered anything through them, but I like to go there to look at stuff, read reviews, and that kind of thing. It's just another source of information. And what I found is that oftentimes people who don't really know what they're talking about say things, and you kind of get the idea from them that, like when somebody says, oh, this is a good mic, but I wouldn't recommend it for vocals, and they're talking about an SM57, right? It's clearly you got to kind of discount that because sure, it can be, it cannot be, it just depends. Everyone knows at this point. If you don't know this at this point, you need to really rethink your philosophy. Any microphone can be a vocal microphone. However, there are ones that typically tend to be a little bit better, like small condenser microphones are typically not the best choice for vocals. However, if you have, a handful of microphones and you haven't tried it on your vocals, you're a fool because you might be surprised. It's amazing how an oddball mic that you typically wouldn't think of as a vocal mic can sometimes do wonders on somebody's voice because it's such a different instrument, Everyone sounds different, right? But here you have people constantly saying, oh, I love it for vocals, but I don't really care for it so much for this, or I love it for guitars, but I haven't found it to be very good for vocals, for my vocals. And that's fine. Not to say that there's not something to be said about that. But I've also heard people say things like, oh, this sub $200-$300 condenser microphone beats out my sounds as good as a Neumann U87, and it's just like, no, it doesn't. it might be flattering to your ears on certain things because we have this tendency to untrained ears tend to hear things differently. And maybe to somebody who doesn't understand the difference between the high end and the low end, they may not realize that they may like the way the cheaper microphone sounds on their voice better because they're a bad vocalist. And the Neumann U87 does an exceptional job of revealing how bad of a vocalist they are. You know, I had it's funny because I had an instance where a good friend of mine decided that he liked the sound of his Shure KSM 32 on his vocals better than the Neumann's, right? U87 that we had at our disposal at that time. And it was through this friend that I had the chance to start using microphones of that caliber, right? And through him, that's where I've really gotten most of my experience on the super high-end gear. Not that I have a ton of it, but I've got enough of it to kind of figure out what the difference is and what it's all about. And what I liked about his review of it, or his commentary, was he goes, the problem is it's too good of a microphone for my vocals. He goes, the reason why I don't like it seems like it's too good. And what he kind of told me, and what I was able to deduce from him, is that, it's an exceptionally good microphone. The problem is that because it's so accurate, it has a tendency to not always be flattering on certain sources. It's kind of like you can't have a spotlight on everything. So perhaps if you use it for your vocals, you might not want to use it on acoustic guitar. If you use it for your overheads, you might not want to also use it for your room mic or for this, that, and the other thing. And that's kind of my take on it, is that it's a great mic, but on its own, it's really the kind of microphone that you want to use to highlight something, right? Not to say you can't have more than one light on a compilation of tracks that form a song, but my general take on a microphone, on the super high-end microphones, is that they're great. They're awesome. I'm not saying they're not worth it, because they are. If you have one, that's awesome. Use it. But I wouldn't recommend using it if you're like a singer-songwriter playing, acoustic and vocals and everything else is kind of light and distant. You might not want to also use that same microphone on your guitars as you would use on your vocals, because it's just so revealing, and it gets to the point where it's almost kind of obnoxious how revealing and accurate it is. Whatever you need something in the background to be not quite so sharp. It's like a picture. You have your focus point, and then you have the stuff that's not the focus point. And when it's a little bit out of focus, it makes the focal point seem that much more vivid and clear, right? But without that contrast, it just kind of almost seems like it's hard for your eyes to really determine what it's supposed to be looking at. And that would be my take on high-end microphones, But here you've got people saying, "Oh, it's not a good vocal mic." Well, that's crap. It's proven itself to be a great vocal mic. Oh, I don't care for it on guitars. That's fine. That's an opinion. But to say that it's bad on guitars, on acoustic guitars, is completely wrong. It's a beautiful mic on acoustic guitars. Perhaps not in the room you're in, perhaps not on your guitar, or perhaps not for the style of music you're playing. But it is a very good, acoustic guitar mic. And I'm not just trying to, boost the Neumann name. Is it a little overpriced? Oh, I'm sure it is. Why does it really cost, over $3,000? Because people will pay it. Does it cost them anywhere near that to make it? I highly doubt it. And for their sake, I hope it doesn't. But people pay it, so they keep charging it, right? And I'm not trying to sound like a Neumann commercial, because I'm not really an especially huge fan of them or of any other mic. I think a lot of these folks make a fine mic for the money, and what I've come to find out is that it's nice to have some very high-end gear, but it's how you use it that really makes the biggest difference, and just knowing when it's appropriate to highlight something and when it's appropriate to use another microphone to mic a source, right? But you go through these gear reviews and hear people talking on microphones like, "Oh, wow, this cheap $100 Chinese condenser mic, it's so great. It has all this nice clarity," right? And then you hear recordings people make with these mics, and then in their mind it sounds great, but you listen to it like, "Oh, well, that's fine. Maybe to somebody with an untrained ear, it's not terrible, but to me it's pretty bad. Like, I'd be embarrassed if this was how my material sounded." Just like there's people who have huge budgets would say to me, "Hey, I'd be embarrassed, Dris, if my music sounded like yours does, because I didn't use a huge budget to do most of my stuff, and that's fine. But once again, you got to read between the lines, because people talking about gear, that is probably one of the most subjective things that can be talked about. Okay, and so while we're on the topic of gear and microphones in particular, just as subjective as gear quality, purchases, and opinions and reviews can be, so too can be how to use them, the application of said gear. And since we're already talking about microphones, and it's a pretty common, easy to understand concept, how you use a microphone tends to be the subject of debate amongst all kinds of people. And it's funny, I'm not saying that there aren't absolute truths and absolute incorrect, opinions necessarily, but it's one of those things where you have to use some judgment. And while it's great to hear people's opinions because it can give you perspective, it can cause you to have these little aha moments, oh, well, no wonder why I'm having problems with this, or, oh, that makes sense, or I can see why this person, does things this way. But you also have to discount, certain types of people and certain types of opinions, right? I'm going to use the case of acoustic guitar miking. Oh, man. Just like drum miking can be super complicated, just something as simple as so seemingly simple as miking an acoustic guitar, that can just have such a spectrum of different answers. And my favorite answer for how to mic an acoustic guitar is this. The guy that goes, I don't know why people put so much, use so many mics or put all this thought and effort. One mic, some foot or so away from the 10th fret, pointing slightly away from the sound hole. Done. Use a large diaphragm condenser and you're done. Well, that's great, and I'm not saying that's not a good way to do it in certain applications, but I've found that for me, that and that alone is not enough to get me where I want to be, simply because of the material I use does not support just a single mono microphone source on the acoustic guitar. And a lot of times people are like, oh, I hate DI. Never use a DI on acoustic. Well, obviously, typically you don't want to do it by itself, although in certain applications, just a DI signal by itself can sound great. But I've kind of noticed that depending on who you are, and where you're recording, what you're recording, how you're doing it, is going to make a huge difference on your opinion on this. If you're at a high dollar studio, there is definitely something to be said about, hey, if you're in a good sounding room, you've got a good player with a nice instrument and the material's good, just do your best to not mess it up. Don't overcomplicate it. Depending on what the use in the song for the acoustic guitar is, a single microphone, a foot or two away from around the roundabouts pointing at the 10th fret might be the perfect choice, right? Or it might be more than good enough, or it might be the right choice considering that it's not important enough to spend 6 hours finding the perfect mic placement for a texture acoustic guitar, right? However, and that's fine. There's times where I will do that, whereas I realize, hey, it's not that important. As long as it's there and doesn't sound terrible and the performance is fine, that's all that really matters, because once again, it's not going to be the highlight of something, so who cares? All right? But at the same time, I've noticed that there are others who say, oh, you have to stereo mic it using matched pairs, otherwise it doesn't sound right. I'm not saying there's not something to that. I personally think that, a couple of small dynamic condenser or small diaphragm condensers is a pretty good sound on acoustic guitar, and a lot of people agree with that. I think it's a great sound. I think it, in a lot of instances, I'd say in about 50% of the cases, a matched pair of small diaphragm condensers is a pretty solid choice, stereo miking a acoustic guitar, and you wonder, there's some kind of rules of how to space them and all kinds of things. Use an XY pattern, which isn't always my favorite. In fact, it's seldomly what I want. I usually like to use a space pair, For example, if I've got if I've got the microphones a foot away from the source, I want them to each be about 3 feet away from each other. That's a general rule. I try to get there, but it seems like it never quite happens that way. And sometimes when I do that, it seems like either the guitars are too wide, and that's not always what I'm looking for. For an acoustic guitar, is a super wide acoustic guitar. It just depends on what I'm looking for. But I don't own small diaphragm condenser microphones, so I tend to use other things because I think small diaphragm condensers are good microphones. I think they can be good for overheads, but since they don't lend themselves generally very well to vocals and a couple of other situations, I don't really have them because I don't think they're a good choice for where I'm at with my gear collection. However, I've also found that a pretty good solution can be just something as simple as sorry about that, a dynamic microphone and a DI. It's amazing how much you can do with just that combination. The DI is going to have a little bit more sparkle and sheen, so to speak, than your dynamic microphone will. I use an Audix i5. I've used SM57s. I'm not saying it's always the right sound for what you're going for, but I've found that oftentimes that can be more than enough to get you where you need to be. I've had another configuration I like is having a dynamic microphone kind of down at the bottom right hand, where I'm right-handed, so you can imagine down at the bottom right of the guitar, where it's basically just microphoning, about an inch or two away from the bottom right hand sort of edge of the top of the guitar. And it doesn't really get a good sound on its own, but it's a very warm and it sounds very much like wood. You really capture the characteristic of the tone wood that's on the top of the guitar, and it sounds pretty good. And then I like to have another microphone, usually kind of around the 10th or so fret, and I usually like to have those mics usually fairly close. And then that's when I like to have that kind of in the distant, anywhere from a foot to 4 foot away, condenser microphone. And that's oftentimes a pretty powerful combination, right? You couple that with a DI and you're in business. There's all kinds of things you can do, but if I'm in that position, I'm going to try to find what the tone I'm looking for is, figure out how I can get it with what I have, and that's what I'm going to use. Now, some of the things I've learned about miking an acoustic guitar have kind of a blend from other people. Like I was recording with a friend of mine, and he was a big fan of the Shure, was it the SM81? I'm sure I'm not saying it right, but basically they're famous, small diaphragm condensers. I'm having a brain fart, but it's like something 81. I think it's an SM81 or something like that. But they're famous, been around for forever. Small diaphragm condensers, great for overheads, acoustic guitars, capturing any kind of percussion, brass instruments, woodwinds. I mean, it's a very good instrument microphone, is what I'll say. It will capture just about any instrument, but generally isn't very good on vocals, right? And the way I saw this guy use them is he put them, he would put them very close to his strings, right, on his neck, and then have one that was very close to the body of his guitar, and that would just be his sound right there. And I thought that's interesting, but doesn't seem to capture the depth. But that's fine because what he was going for, was not a very good. They were more like rock guitars, so they didn't need to have that depth to them, But it was an acoustic miking source, so it was kind of like, okay, I see why he does it differently than what most people would say to do, and it works, right? So I took that kind of thing, and I noticed when I was mixing this stuff, it's like, wow, there's not a whole lot of depth here, but I see why he likes it that way for his music. It makes sense. Doesn't mean I should do it for everything, but I liked it. Just like I've also seen the same person, just put one microphone about 4 feet back and call it a day. This is fine. And I've seen a lot of people use a lot of different techniques. And then I also heard a lot of people scoff at these said techniques as being inferior because they have this opinion that, they're more knowledgeable. If you have to resort to using a DI track, it's because you didn't mic it right or this, that, and the other thing. And once again, you got to read between the lines there, because the way that a super professional high-end studio guy would go about miking an acoustic guitar are likely going to be very, very different than how you're going to do it in your own spare room, right, in your own home studio. And just like the person in between, might need to take a look at that. If you're recording a very amateur guitar player, sometimes less is more, I found that generally you want those, it's kind of funny, you put the mic real close up, it captures all the clanks because they're not a very strong player yet, right? But you move it too far back, then it's like, oh, geez, it captures too much of it. So you kind of find a happy medium. And it's almost, I found on very amateur guitar players, you almost want that microphone nowhere near the fretboard because you hear all the squeaks and the clanks and the string noise from not hitting the strings correctly with your fingers. And that's okay. You don't want to tell them that, but, it's just one of those things. Hey, you know what? Let's just put this one microphone right down here, and then we'll also use a DI track. We're going to use a microphone down at the, pointing as far away from the sound hole as possible, down at the very bottom right hand of the body of the guitar. Then you couple it with a DI track, and it's like you get the warmth from the guitar tone wood, and it sounds kind of realistic, just very thuddy and muddy, so to speak. You cut some of the low mids out, you add the DI track, and all of a sudden, hey, this sounds like an acoustic guitar, kind of soft pan of maybe 50% each. It's like, whoa, this actually sounds pretty convincing that it's a guitar player. I'm not saying it's the ideal way to do things, but you got to know who you're recording and what you're recording. And sometimes doing things in ways that other people say is typically wrong is actually the right choice. Just like most people say, they don't like using dynamic microphones on acoustic guitars, and I totally understand why. But there's a lot of times where it makes a lot of sense to use one because, especially if you're using for like texture guitars, unless you want something that has a lot of high end and in the guitar track, generally speaking, you cut the lows, you cut the highs, and you just use, basically 500 to about 5,000 or the main, frequency response range that you don't cut the hell out of on your backing acoustic guitar track. So you could have done that, or you could have just put a SM57 there and you'd have been fine, and it scoops out the mids so that it doesn't get in the way of the vocals, Not a bad choice for that application. So once again, you need to read between the lines when it comes to microphone placement or just using any gear, because there's all kinds of ways to use things. And while there may be some hard, fast rules as this is completely wrong, like you might not want to point the microphone at the source backwards. That might not be the best source, the best use of that microphone, but at the same time, there are no hard, fast rules of what is the absolute right way to do things. There are definitely wrong ways, but there is no 100% guaranteed, absolute 100% of the time, this is the way you do it, right? So take that into consideration, because people really have a tendency to, well, this famous recording engineer does it this way, so I'm going to do that. And like, hey, that's good that you're humble enough to and realize that, hey, there are people who are genuinely good and better at this than you, and you want to take their advice or do things like they do. That's fine. We all want to aspire to be like Christ. The problem is we're not Jesus Christ. We're not those high-end, recording engineers. We're not recording the same level of talent. And our room is completely different. The microphones we're using is very different. The preamps, the gear, everything we're using is different. So it stands to reason that if you're using completely different gear and a completely different, environment, that it's a good chance you might have to do things completely differently than that guy or gal, right? It stands to reason, but people don't always look at it like that. Oh, well, I heard that you want to. Who cares about what you heard? If it sounds good, it is good. That's what matters. And then on that note, what really sounds good? Talk about another subjective area, good sounds and good sounding music and what instrument sounding better than another. It's very subjective, but is there really a right and wrong here? Are there things that genuinely sound better than others? Well, of course. But once again, when it comes to reviewing things and looking up product testimonials and trying to figure out what's the right thing for you to buy or what's the right sound, how you should use your gear to achieve said sound, and does this sound good? Once again, you have to kind of use your own ears here, but this is another avenue where it gets very, very confusing and subjectivity reigns king. Okay, so for me to kind of wrap up this reading between the lines episode and kind of how I'm leading into this is, what really sounds good? What's the kind of sound you're looking for? And, this is one of those things where people's opinions vary so much, and there's not really a right or wrong answer. I'm going to talk a little bit about guitar distortion pedals. Like, it is stupid how many of them there are out on the market. I mean, it is beyond ridiculous. Like, there is no way I'm ever going to try out all these distortion pedals. And for a number of reasons, hey, there's so many of them. But a part of the problem is you try one, it's like, oh, okay, I don't really care for it. I don't care for this or that, but I can see why others would. I can see, oh, it's good for this, it's not good for that, whatever. But at some point, it gets to where, like, there are just certain things I don't really care for that others love, right? And it doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of, like, the vintage, like, big muff kind of distortion sound. I hear it on different sources and it sounds great for that, but for what I do, it generally has never really been a very viable option. Yet, it's amazing how just a little bit of that texture or sound of something that you really don't generally like works great in a mix. That's why I love the amp and, pedal simulators, guitar simulator things that are out there. Because, for $100 or so, you get access to a bunch of stuff that sounds, I mean, it's in the ballpark. It doesn't sound exactly the same, and it doesn't generally sound quite as good, but it gets the idea across. It's close enough to in the ballpark. It's, it might be in the nosebleed section of the bleachers. It may not be first row off of first base, but it's at least in the same ballpark. But when it comes to hearing people talk about distortion pedals for guitars or even bass for that matter, oh my gosh, like there's so much snobbery about how, generally speaking, I stick with Boss pedals just because I'm comfortable with them. They tend to work pretty well. But I've had a Boss Metal Zone at some point in my life, and I thought it was pretty good. I like the way it sounds. Yet I hear how people just bash the Metal Zone like it's this cheap piece of crap. It doesn't sound good, this, that, or the other thing. Well, I'll say it's not my favorite distortion sound for a lot of instances. It doesn't sound bad, and you don't have to turn it all the way up. You can blend it. It's okay. But then again, I've also heard about my little, I think it's called the DS1. It's this Boss Mix. It's like their cheapest little orange distortion pedal. And I'll be the first one to tell you that it's not on its own an especially good sounding distortion pedal, but I found it can work very, very well in a lot of instances. And it's just one of those things. I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't think on its own it's always the greatest sounding distortion I've ever heard. But it works for so many instances where I can't tell you how many times I've used it to add just a layer of distortion to vocal tracks, bass tracks, snare samples, kick sounds, all kinds of stuff. Granted, I'm going out of the box here, but when you're trying to engineer a sound, it's amazing what will work, especially when you're in a pinch. So as far as, what sounds good grief, use your own ears, listen to what other people use. And if you're trying to make a decision as to, what do I need to buy to achieve this sound? There's really not just one answer for it. There's so many things that you can do to achieve this sound. And then you've also got to take into consideration, you also have to discount your own opinion as well as others because, certain people like guitar junkies, we have a tendency to discount certain types of distortion sounds or other sounds because we identify them as being cheap sounding. But it's amazing how they can work very well, maybe not in the traditional sense, but, whereas somebody who is not a guitar player, they hear it and they hear distortion. They hear that $300 distortion pedal that this guitar players drool over like, wow, this thing sounds so great. And then somebody with something that costs like $60, like one of those cheesy, like Dan Electro, like macaroni and cheese pedals or T-bone steak pedals, which they're cool, but I think they suck. But that's just my opinion. Yeah, somebody who's not like a guitar tone junkie hears it and is like, yep, sounds like distortion, sounds good. You know, they don't really see it that way or hear it that way. So, I mean, as far as when it comes to sounding good, you can take distortion pedals and it's just amazing how many different sounds there are and how much the prices vary and how many different models of this, that, and the other thing are and how many distortion pedals a lot of us guitar players have and just how unnecessary it is, you know? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what distortion pedal you're using. If you're playing Yankee Doodle, it doesn't matter. You know, another thing that I've heard a lot of a product that I use that I hear get bashed a lot are the KRK Rocket 5 monitors. I own a pair of them, and I'm not saying that they're the greatest pair of monitors. I'm not saying they're the best sounding monitors out there, but you know what? To my ear, they sound fine. You know, they make noise so I can have an idea of what I'm listening to. All right. Yet you also have to discount my opinion because I'm in a mostly untreated room. I'm not like a super seasoned professional, but I'm also more seasoned than the average home studio person is, and I'm a little farther along than the typical person is. All right. Even a lot of these people that are on the forums talking about, you know, oh, how they don't like this or that and the other thing, that's great. To me, I know that they're not the best. I'd be much better off with a set of faux calls or something like that. But the truth is, they get the job done. I know what their shortcomings are, and you just kind of work around it, right? Same thing with these distortion pedals. You know that if you turn them up all the way, that they tend to get real fuzzy and you can't really make out what's going on. That's fine, turn it down. But there might be times when it's like, hey, you know what? I need it to be like this. And it's great that you have that option. That's why it's not just a pedal with no knobs and you just click the button, right? Because it's subjective and the sound you're looking for is going to change from one instance to another, not just from song to song, just from verse to chorus. That's why we have the button, you know, so you can turn it off and on, you can vary it as you want. But as far as what sounds good, that's you really have to read between the lines there because nobody's necessarily right or wrong. There's just certain people whose opinions seem to matter more, right? But at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that I think doesn't sound good as far as people's recordings. Are like, oh, like I'm not going to say who, but there's a fairly famous guitar player that had been in one band for quite a while, very well known for that, and then joined another one kind of later on in his career, kind of formed a super group. And I hate his guitar tones. Like, I just can't stand him. He's an awesome guitar player, and I know he knows what he's doing. And so it's not like I can really say he's wrong or discount his opinion on his guitar tones, but I just can't stand it. And every time I hear a lot of these songs, I'm like, oh, God, it's so awful. Yet, it sold millions of copies. You know what I mean? So just like I'm saying, you got to discount other people's opinions. You got to discount mine. You got to discount your own. You got to discount everything and just find the common denominator and try to do your best to find the truth of what really matters. Because the truth is you have to read between the lines, right? So you got to realize that there's going to be a difference of opinion from somebody who's not very experienced and knowledgeable to somebody who's super experienced and knowledgeable, but doesn't work at the same capacity that you do. Working with, very budget-minded people on recording them and their gear purchases and all that kind of thing is very different than you working with somebody who's got $1 million to spend on a studio and gear, right? Because their headspaces and what they're looking for are very, very different, right? So whereas, somebody who's maybe on the low end is looking for versatility, that might be more paramount than somebody who's on the extreme high end, who's like, I don't care how versatile it is, I need it to do this, and that's fine. And I'll know that when I need to do this, I'll use this piece of gear. When I need something to sound like this, I'll use that piece of gear. Where somebody like me is like, you know what, I need a Swiss Army knife. I don't need anything that's necessarily the best at doing this or that. I just need something that can do all of it. And then as my skills and my skill set increases, my customer base increases, and I have actually merit having, that more high-end gear where it actually makes sense, then yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and buy it. But at some point, you need a compressor. You know what I mean? If all possible, find one that does as much as you need it to do and does it as well as you need it to, and then move on from there, It's like distortion pedals. Sure, we'd all like to have 18 different distortion pedals, but at some point, you just need one or two that that do as much as you need them to do, right? And same thing with people's opinions. Read between the lines, figure out and see and kind of understand their headspace and their mindset of why they feel a certain way. Take somebody on the opposite end, see how they feel, and try to focus on people who are in the same position as you, and that's where you put your most credibility is. Maybe you don't want to listen to people's opinions on $3,000 microphones. You also probably don't want to listen to people's opinions on $100 microphones. But listening to people talk about their experiences and what's worked well for them, who people are kind of in the same general boat that you're in, more than likely they're going to have the most relevant knowledge to share with you, and more so than that super experienced person who's super credible. So just something to kind of think about. Alrighty, y'all. Thanks for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to get back to this as much as I can. I'm going to do my best to stay on top of this, finish up all these episodes I've got ready to go, get them ready to go, and I'm going to keep doing this. I'm not going to stop, but forgive me. I've definitely kind of fallen off the wagon a little bit, but I'm going to keep at it, and because I think people really need to hear what I have to say. It's that important. All right, that's bullshit. All right, y'all have a good one. Adios.